This is the Rebound series. My name is Farai Mwakutuya, and I do thank you for joining us once again. We continue our discussions focusing on different sectors and spheres of Zimbabwean life, focusing on what the issues are, but crucially, what can be done to take us forward. Today, we are focusing on the economy. In recent weeks, we've seen pronouncements coming from Treasury of very bullish projections, very optimistic projections of the future. First of all, that Zimbabwe is now a $24 billion GDP economy. We also know that government is sticking to its 7.4% growth projections for 2021. We've also seen some market commentators talking about the fact that business confidence is at an all-time high. We know that there is a continued or persistent current account surplus. And so today we are unpacking what that means for the ordinary Zimbabwean. Are these figures realistic, and what can be done to achieve them if they are not? To help me discuss this, I'm joined in the studio now by Mr. Japhet Moyo, the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions. Sir, great to have you on the program.
Thank you very much, Farai. Good afternoon or evening to everyone listening or watching.
Alongside him is a trade and economic expert, none other than Dr. Gift Mugano. Great to have you on the program, sir.
Thank you, Farai. Thank you for having me here.
Let's get straight into it. I'll start with you, Dr. Mugano. The finance minister has been on record as saying that, 24 billion GDP economy. There will be 7.4% growth in the economy this year, despite COVID. In fact, saying that we may have weathered the COVID-19 storm. Do you agree with these assessments and these projections?
Yes, clearly from a mathematical point of view. Look, if you are coming from a dish, like last year, we had a negative growth rate of around 10%, negative recession. Clearly, when there's any addition to production, there's a difference which gives you a positive growth rate. If you wind back to 2009, when we joined unity government and we're coming from 2008, where the economy had clearly collapsed, the growth rates of that time, 2009 to 2013, averaged 10.7%. We were the highest growing economy from a numbers point of view, because we're coming from zero, from a lower base. So I believe that it won't even surprise me if we exceed 10% growth rate from a numbers point of view.
Mm-hmm. I see you had pains to say numbers.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the reality on the ground may not necessarily translate to that?
Correct, because clearly you got me right there. The numbers means nothing to people who are in the economy from every spheres of life. Those numbers don't transform to access to medical services, access to education, access to jobs. They're just numbers. It reminds me of in early 2000, the former president of Mozambique, Amanda Tebusa. They were in our situation where they were having sustained growth rate. But his question at one of the forums, I think it was Mozambique Economic Forum, where he was asking that you are telling me that this economy is growing, but why are we dying of malaria? Right? It's our similar situation where you are told nice stuff, but when you want to connect your life to it, you are still at square one.
Mr. Moyo, Labour, what's your take on what's being said?
As my colleagues is just alluding to, connect our lives to the figures that are being projected. Obviously, we have challenges with those figures. However, we seem to have a different view in terms of whether these figures are correct or not. In our view, we believe that these figures are, ambitious. We have reasons why we think these figures are ambitious. At the moment, the number of our members or workers generally, I think 80% of the people are probably at home at the moment because of COVID-19. The enterprises have decongested the workplace. Production has gone down, as we know. So how then do we expect that this economy will grow by 7.4? So we expect the officials probably to revise these figures as we proceed mid-year we might see less than that. Already, the global world, they have indicated that the economy general will grow by probably 4.3. How would Zimbabwe grow by 7.4 when many countries are doing even are going to be doing less than that? So these are figures that probably will be revised. One, two, these figures are not correct. Three, these figures don't mean anything to ordinary people in Mbare and Msika and deep in Cholocho. Those people are traveling to nearest clinic and are told, sorry, there is no Panadol here. So they mean nothing.
Mm-hmm. In view of that, and you are the economist, so we'll put you on the spot and say, should we then ignore these on paper figures that don't translate to the lived reality? What sort of parameters, matrix should we be using to measure economic success or growth that are meaningful and relevant?
I think what is very important is how we get there. How do we get an average growth rate of 7.4%? So as I'm saying, last year we had two tragedies. We had drought and we had COVID-19. So we were in a deep slump. So we're just coming out. So to me, you can even hit 10%. That I'm still convinced. But what is very important is economic transformation. We don't want to see growth without economic transformation. How is this growth shared? Is it shared within the context of people getting jobs in manufacturing sector and we grow with the growth rate? Or is it driven from a numbers point of view, number crunching? Because also understand that the number of drivers who are going to be driving this growth rate, the economic stability itself, which you were talking about in your opening remarks, also guarantee this growth rate. Because when there's higher inflation, you don't have sustained growth rate, right? But how are you sustaining stability by running a surplus? I don't know whether we're going to get there in our discussion. But how do you get the surplus in the budget to avoid printing money? If you are getting a surplus by cutting my leg, and that is avoiding paying civil servants, what reasonable salaries, what the government is doing, which have taken us to a situation where learners are not learning anything in schools. They are seated because teachers are at home. That growth rate now is meaningless. So what should be done? Government must be very true to the point on how they drive their growth rate, because you cannot tell me that you have a growth rate of 7.4%, but you can't pay teachers and learners are not going to school. The reality on the ground is that students are not learning anything. So we rather have a lower growth rate when we are running a balanced budget or even a reasonable deficit, when we are able to pay people, and then it becomes meaningful. So it's in the mechanics on how we get there.
Mr. Moyo, interesting. Okay, come in.
I think it's easier to do it. It's easier for me to say I was not able to exhaust my paycheck. It's easier to say that. I might be able to keep part of my paycheck, 50% of it, 60% of it, and my kids are not going to school. There is starvation at home. It's easier to do that. But I can still boast and say, I was not able to exhaust my paycheck. Is this what our government is doing? Probably, yes.
Yeah.
The point I wanted to put to you, and you said it earlier, you said that a significant number of people are at home, are homebound because of COVID-19, the lockdowns and things like that. At the same time, it is the same labor that is demanding higher pay. Where will the money come from? If you're not working and being productive, how do you balance that? Because there is also, yes, reasonable salaries must be paid, but government is also saying we don't have the resources because there hasn't been adequate production, or people aren't working, or we just don't have the resources.
I think our demand is based on what we are getting from the economists, what we are getting from the officials, what we are getting from industry itself. Industry is telling us that capacity utilization has gone up. So as far as we are concerned, I think there is business. But also I think it might be a contradiction to the earlier session that I alluded to. If a number of people are not at work, and what it means, business might be saving. They might be saving space, they might be saving utilities within the enterprises. So they are making money, probably. But our demand mostly as labor is based on what we want. This is what we consume. So it's based on the needs. What is it that we need for us to be able to send our kids to school, attend to our health care, and live a decent life? These statistics coming from Zimstats tells us that probably we need 26,000. So it's not about how much the enterprises are doing, but what is it that a family of 6 requires for it to sustain a month. So that's the basis of our demand in the collective bargaining processes.
Dr. Mugano, the implications of meeting that 26,000 demand on inflation, but also at the same time where conventional economic advice is that don't spend beyond your means. The IMF, some of their prescriptions are do not exceed your wage budget must not exceed what you're able to pay. How do you reconcile that with this situation where workers want to be paid? You spoke about a reasonable wage, but we are in this situation.
I think what is very important is to look at it in a complicated manner. Would you want to maintain a surplus when you can't, when nothing is happening in hospitals, in clinics, and in schools, and then you say you want to have a surplus, but you are forfeiting a future in terms of human capital and the well-being of the people? That's number one. Then the second issue is that it depends on the responsiveness of that increase in salary to aggregate demand, how demand is going to respond, right? So if I pay workers in a decent way, say minimum poverty line, right? Naturally, you expect a stimulation of production to take off. So economics is not a straight jacket, where you say if you give people too much money, there will be inflation. It depends on how it is channeled, right? If it is given to civil servants, for example, naturally you see more lines of credits taking place. They can go to the shops and buy. Right now, can they buy? They can buy. The civil servants, even workers in general, have got a serious debt. So there's now a reduction in demand for the goods, which means companies cannot even produce for the same market. So it's a balancing act. That's why in economics we studied about the general equilibrium analysis. You want to understand the whole economy, how it is balancing. So it's not a calculated thing. You need to study the economy. And the IMF cannot sit in Washington and say, don't do this as prescription. You need to understand your own context on how it is wired. Yeah.
We need to take a short break now, and we will return. This is the Rebound series. We're discussing the economy, economic growth projections, and how we can achieve them. Stay tuned. Every Zimbabwean wants their country to return to its former glory, and we believe that we have a role to play in doing that. So we'll be speaking to different Zimbabweans from different facets of life to share their views of what it will take to get Zimbabwe to rebound. The Rebound series comes to you every Friday between 5 and 6 p.m. on the Heart and Soul digital platforms. Join me, Farai Mwakutuya, for those incisive discussions. Welcome back. I thank you for staying with us. This is the Rebound series. And today we're focusing on the economy. As I mentioned earlier, our panelists include Mr. Japhet Moyo, Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, alongside Professor Gift Mugano, economist, who, before we went to the break, you were talking about, we spoke about some of the issues that us around this surplus, that, we're running a surplus, we are told by Treasury, yet you say that it's inconsistent because we are running a surplus but are unable to pay wages, unable to fund hospitals. So my question then would be, what is the purpose of the surplus? Is there some future use that we are reserving it for?
Okay, maybe to answer it in two ways. First, for the audience, for them to understand, is it a real surplus? And then it comes at the other side. First, the surplus to me is artificial. Because as long as we have it on record that our embassies has not been paid on time, and they have areas which are running several years and they're being kicked out of residence. You know, we are talking about international engagement. This is the Minister of Finance, who is also a key player on international engagement. But he is going to be meeting ambassadors and officials who are coming from elsewhere, who have been staying in their residence, who have been kicked out of it, but he can't pay them. And one of the reviews which we did, which was in public domain with the Parliament, we even saw that by the end of, beginning of this year, we had not paid subscription for some international commitments like the World Trade Organization. But you are running a surplus and you are branding yourself that way. Is it a real surplus? I'm not talking about the teachers. I'm not talking about the hospitals and the clinics. I'm talking about the exposure of what we call surplus internationally. So we don't have a surplus. What has happened, the Minister of Finance deliberately avoided paying some expenses like this, which I'm talking about, deliberately ignored the calls by workers to raise salaries to the level which is in tandem with the poverty line and the negotiations to create a surplus. So it's like as good as a father in the rural areas who is saying, I don't owe anyone money in the community, but his kids are not going to school, his kids are not going to hospital. So it's trying to fool oneself to look good when you are looking very ugly. This is the reality on the ground. It doesn't work, even if to say, why are we doing it? The intention, of course, is to pin on inflation, is to manage money supply. I don't think, I think the minister is missing the point. He thinks balancing the budget deals with inflation. Yes, it does. But there's also a school of thought which is missing, where you can run a deficit, but when you are supporting production or agents which can stimulate production. Remember when we were going to the break, we were saying the economy is very complicated. If you pay your workers very well, you stimulate demand, and then there's more production responsiveness. So we need to have a scientific analysis to this whole issue, where we are saying, if we give workers money, what is the response? That information can be established. Because right now we are running a danger where our workers, everyone is very poor, and those who are producing for the poor, and there's no demand. So eventually you cut back on your production. So there's no surplus in reality to talk about. It's a fake surplus, and even if you tick the box, you are ticking the box of intention to really cut my leg to make a surplus. It doesn't work in the economy.
Mr. Moyo, you've made mention of very sad circumstances of we hear teachers often saying that they are teaching but they can't afford to send their children to school. In the private sector there are similar examples.
Of course, civil servants are the most disadvantaged at the moment. They are supposed to be providing service to the state, and the state is very important because it is the one that is running the affairs of the country. So they need to be incentivized. I think for us to deal with corruption, whether in the roads, you need to pay police officers good salaries. You want to improve your education system in the coming 5-10 years. You want to pay lecturers, you want to pay teachers, you want a healthy system that is functioning, you need to pay nurses, doctors. You are building a country, you are building an economy, you are building a society. These are the people that are running the engine, so they need to be paid. Unfortunately, our government is found wanting. If you look around the region and compare a car driven by a civil servant in Botswana, a car driven by a civil servant in South Africa, and a car driven by a civil servant in Zimbabwe. They're two different things. A civil servant in Botswana with a pay slip can go to a bank and get a high purchase and drive a new car. Same applies in South Africa. They can't do it here. We are a civil servant, but you cannot access a mortgage, you can't access anything. The poorest, and that natures corruption is very unfortunate. What makes then the situation a bit sad, and then we have a government that says, sorry, we have a lot of money that we did not spend. So what happens with that money? It will appear like probably that information about the surplus is not true. That's fact. Why do they then tell the nation that their books are balancing, they've got surplus? I think economists should be able to tell us exactly what is the intention.
The purpose of this show, as I said earlier, is solutions and to try and come up with a way forward. If I was to put it to you as labor, obviously, I think the key thing would be for you to be paid what you want to be paid. You mentioned the 26,000 Zimbabwe dollars as a figure, the poverty datum line.
From today morning, they're saying it's now 28,000. Mm-hmm.
What, in your view, should be done to get us to that 28,000 or more? What would you like to do? What would you see are your recommendations?
Our recommendation is that looking at the statistics that they've made available to us, that production has increased, the economic growth forecast is positive. Our view is that, of course, something that we have mentioned over the years, and the business have not been in agreement with us, is how are we able to share this cake? Because most of our business people, their lifestyle have not changed. Just look across the city, northern part of the city, and look at the mansions that are being built and the lifestyle that is in that part of the northern part of the suburbs. Clearly, people do have the resources, people do have the money. Are we able to share that cake equally? Probably that's the issue. So businesses might be making money. That's why we have these are projections that everything is fine, stability. At the TNF, the business have not been supportive of us probably adopting another currency because the Zim dollar currency, which is the Arab TGS, is worthless. Because they are making money. So the resources are there. They are allowed to trade in US dollars, but they can then go out and ban that US dollar and pay workers in useless bonds or RTGS. In our view, it's about the greediness that we have taken as the way of living. We are not able to share what we can produce as a nation equally. That's why I'm talking about the difference between what you can see in the northern suburbs and what you can witness in the southern suburbs.
The issue of currency. There have been currency reforms going back to June 2020, the introduction of the auction rate, which, depending on who you speak to, has brought stability, allows better planning. Some businesses saying now, because the rate has stabilized, they can plan for the future better. We've just heard some sentiment here that the Zimbabwe dollar is useless. What is your take in terms of what has been done in terms of currency reforms and how we fix it? How do we get confidence in the Zimbabwe dollar? Or should we do away with it and adopt the US completely?
Thank you, Farai. I think the issues of currency should be centered around the production and the productivity. You know, in economics, the strength of the currency is explained around the production capacity of any country. So if you're unproductive, we can go in round and circles and say, let's have the US dollar today, tomorrow it will go out. Do you know why the US dollar went out? It was because we took the US dollars during the 2009 to 2013. We were not productive. So we're not earning the US dollars. So we're creating artificial US dollars, virtual US dollars. So when you go into the bank and draw money, there are charges. Those charges are increasing the money in circulation, money supply. Interest rate, they increase the money supply, but you're not earning that money, right? So from where I sit, it's an issue of production. So coming back to the fast track to the 2020 June when we had the auction system, for me, the auction system under the failure by banks to trade on the interbank market was the only way to go. It's a temporary mechanism. I think the banks weren't trading among themselves. The reason why I don't want to pay profit, but the bottom line, they weren't trading among themselves. So hence the central bank took over that responsibility. And clearly it's not a free market system is where I sit, because a market has to be having, it's a platform where there are many players, many buyers and sellers. So there are the sellers of foreign currency are limited. it's central bank selling foreign currency, and the buyers are more. So it's a monopolized situation. And naturally, you can't say it's a free market. Ideally, you want to get to a point where the banks are taking care of the platform, where we go back to the interbank, and there should be systems and supervision and regulations where there's no moral hazards taking place, like manipulation and also side marketing. But in as far as the stability is concerned, yes, we have stability around the two exchange rates, the formal rate at 84 and the black market at 126, 130, somewhere there. They are stabilizing at their levels. The real challenge and threat to the economy is the difference of the rates. We need to have convergence where the official rate is equal to the parallel market rate.
How do we get there?
We get there by one, increasing more players in the trading of that foreign currency. So central bank must at some point get off the market, and the banks does it. It will just converge. Naturally in economics it doesn't converge 1:1. There should be a disparity of not more than 15% because there are more players. But we should also be increasing supply of foreign currency by being productive to avoid importing useless things like toothpicks and chewing gums. We should also get to a point where we are exporting more. We have investor-friendly policies to attract more capital to come to this economy. A well-functioning economy. It's not an overnight job.
Long term. Yeah. Very last, as we head to wrapping up this segment, I want to ask you, Mr. Mo, you mentioned earlier in your comments of the TNF, which we were told is, this is the platform that will come up with this social contract that will say, look, going forward, industry, employers, labor, government, let's sit together and come up with a way forward. It's been on the cards. It has been happening in the process for several years now, but we don't seem to get to that promised land. What is the holdup?
Yes, it has not produced the desired results in other countries, not in Europe only, because this idea, I think, we copied it from the Swedish model, which is talked about in the Nordic countries. It worked very, very well, and the economies have done well over the years, social dialogue, and we have borrowed this concept. I think in our own Zimbabwean situation is still having its own teething issues. The way it is structured, because what we discussed at the TNF is still subjected to a political structure. It's called cabinet. That then destroys whatever conversation, open conversations that people can have, business conversations that people can have outside that, because whatever is discussed at the platform, it has to be subjected to a political grouping. So there are these teething issues, I think, that we have to deal with first.
But certainly we wish you all the best in that and hope that it will achieve the desired results and outcomes. I want to thank you so much, Mr. Japhet Moyo, for coming through to the program. He's the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, and alongside him was Professor Gift Mugano. He's an economist, a trade expert, also sharing his insights in terms of what needs to be done to get us more productive, to get us to produce more foreign currency that will then, satiate the market and address some of the challenges and the disparities that we continue to see. This discussion will continue. Stay tuned. This is the Rebound series. Every Zimbabwean wants their country to return to its former glory, and we believe that we have a role to play in doing that. So we'll be speaking to different Zimbabweans from different facets of life to share their views of what it will take to get Zimbabwe to rebound. The Rebound series comes to you every Friday between 5 and 6 p.m. on the Heart and Soul digital platforms. Join me, Farai Mwakutuya, for those incisive discussions. Welcome back. The Rebound series continues here only on Heart and Soul Broadcasting Services. Once again, my name is Farai Mwakutuya. Now, for this segment of the show, I'm going to turn to a UK-based development economist, and she will be sharing more insights on the discussion that we've just been having, Zimbabwe's economy, the issues in terms of what challenges we face now, but crucially, how we move forward from here. Again, revisiting and unpacking some of those projections, very lofty, very optimistic, that we've heard coming through from officials in Treasury, and just getting some insights from her vantage point abroad in the UK. Let me welcome now to the program Chenai Moyo Mtambasere. She is a development economist. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Farai. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Indeed. Now, we kicked off this discussion speaking earlier to the panel I had in the studio, and we're focusing on, these growth projections that are coming through from the finance minister, 7.4% for 2021, suggestions that we may have weathered the COVID storm, that will emerge from this much stronger, all very upbeat, all very bullish. From where you're sitting, do you see the same?
I don't. I mean, it goes without surprise that we're not even over the pandemic yet. We're still kind of hoping that through the uptake of the vaccine, through, improvement in the region in terms of how we're responding to COVID, that we've come almost to the end of it, but nobody really knows. So to kind of come out really that optimistic, I think it takes some doing. I think we're a long way away from optimism. We're still coming out of the pandemic. We've had a long period of kind of, lockdown where there was no economic activity. So I was quite astounded. But having said that, 7% growth, it's a positive figure. But if you consider where we are, it's not really enough of an improvement to really make a fundamental difference to the lives and to the economy of Zimbabwe, really. So I would take kind of those positive statements, unfortunately, with a huge pinch of salt, perhaps even some black pepper on it as well, because it really is, it doesn't tally with what we're seeing on the ground in Zimbabwe, what we're seeing the world over. I mean, it's a global pandemic. There are a lot of critical success factors for anyone to be hinting towards a positive outturn.
Well, I suppose, the timing of these statements could speak to the fact that the finance minister is touring, is going abroad to try and seek investment, so perhaps trying to paint a more positive picture of Zimbabwe. What we've also heard is that business confidence is at an all-time high. Now, not at a national level, but at an individual business level, private sector, do you see some opportunities? Do you see a rebound coming out of this COVID pandemic, coming out of where we're coming from? A lot of people obviously talking about the very good rainy season we've had.
Yeah, so I mean, it's the rain is good. I mean, we're looking obviously at import substitution. So where we had previously, where we were starting to import things like maize and other grains, we can now rely on our own supply, which is great. So really grateful for that. However, we've got still a very low or minimal domestic demand. We've not had incomes. We've got a huge informal sector that has been in lockdown for the last 8 months. So that continues to weigh in on our domestic demand. Moving on from that, you might consider maybe exports. However, we do rely on Zambia, for instance, in the region for our export market, and we've seen that Zambia is in a contractionary state. So in terms of what we can expect from them in terms of business, it's very limited. Everybody is affected by this pandemic. So I wouldn't say necessarily that we will see immediate gains from the rains. I mean, we've got other, just speaking to farmers and considering things like tobacco and the value of the tobacco crop from the heavy rains, we expect that value will go down. So I think there's more to say in terms of how we can actually get more resilient. I think the next season should be more about resilience as opposed to this kind of spurious idea that we're suddenly going to come out of it, full guns blazing, maximum profit, maximum growth. I think we need to take a step back, be realistic, and focus on resilience.
How do we achieve that resilience? You speak about the next season being about establishing that resilience. How do you suggest we go about that?
So we need to look more at our local demand. So what is happening in our domestic markets? How can we make the informal sector survive lockdown? How do we make the informal sector rebound? How do we make things easier for them? And then we're also looking to things like how do we make our value chains affordable? So at the moment, we know that people, maybe domestic sales were increasing because really we couldn't go anywhere. But with borders opening up, it still is more profitable. It is still more viable to go and shop in South Africa than it is to shop in Zimbabwe. So we need to focus at how we can improve the factors of our domestic market, how we get a better value chain, we improve our manufacturing so that we can pass on some of those cost savings to consumers, so that locally we really need to do a lot more at home and seize this kind of dependence across borders. So I think that is where our resilience is. It's about equipping our informal sector so that in the case that there is a third wave and we might need to go into lockdown again, how do we make it so that small businesses can still operate, so that our informal markets can still operate in observing the COVID necessities? So how do we do that? That's where I'd like us to focus as a country, as an economy, on our domestic markets. How do we improve our financial service offering as well? Because we know that quite a huge percentage of our population is unbanked. So we have some fiscal or monetary attributes around the formal auction, which I will put in inverted commas for obvious reasons, that really not a lot of businesses participate in that because they kind of forced out in terms of the informal sector because they're not part of the banked community. So how do we improve that relationship between citizens and the financial service industry? Again, that is another pointer in terms of building that economic resilience.
Well, I think a very interesting point you raised there about the need to, capacitate or prepare the informal sector for a potential third wave or any other challenges other headwinds that might come our way. Interestingly, I was listening to a news report where, vendors and small traders in Victoria Falls are asking for some sort of assistance or reprieve because they've been out, as you say, under lockdown for several months, but they've been slapped with the presumptive tax bill, which they obviously can't afford. How do you reconcile government requiring revenue because of the need to do certain things, but failing to get it, and so now going after those people who are earning something?
Exactly. So, I mean, this is where I'm saying that we need, you see, resilience is about making sure that we survive. We're going through a tough time the world over. So let's make sure that we survive that. And this is not the time for increasing government revenue through tax. It's about sustaining, it's more sort of, let's look at how we make sure that we accommodate, especially the informal sector, because quite frankly, they are keeping us alive as a country. You're looking at over 70% of economic activity is happening in the informal market. So how do we make sure that they can at least survive this year? They can survive this kind of financial year, as it were, in the hope that in the future, yes, we can start to look at revenue through tax, etc. But we can't start introducing those kinds of things now. It's just really not the time, because we need to just be able to survive, get over the line, get to the point where everyone is safe in the world, and the R numbers are low, and we can all start to function again as normal. So that's where we need to get to, and we're not going to get there if we're starting to penalize people through tax and things like this when we've all been in lockdown. It makes no sense.
You spoke earlier about the auction and the fact that some businesses can't participate, but just your own views on this auction. When you speak to, depending on who you speak to in the private sector, some companies are saying it has brought stability. We can now plan because the rates, we more or less know where it's going to be. People are able to access it at that rate and not the parallel market rate. What's your take on how the auction has gone since it was launched in June 2020?
Well, so firstly, my view is that it's not an auction, because an auction is something that is determined by markets. And if you've got a fixed rate for this long and it stayed at 83, 84 since last June, I mean, that is not an auction. right? Because at an auction, you're bidding, the price is changing. When the price is not changing, it's not an auction. It's a pegged exchange rate regime. And of course, there are winners in this. For sure, because if you've got two competing markets that have held on, so the parallel market has held on the whole time since June. We've never walked outside and said, I want to exchange some money and not found any way to do it, right? The parallel market has held on, and this kind of formal auction market has held on as well. So where you've got the two markets and they've got very different, there's a 35% difference in rate, there will be winners in that. And of course, they will say it's great because it is great for them. I mean, if I can buy something for 83 and sell it at 115, 35% straight away, that's a 35% profit. Of course, it's great, But when you look at the overall picture, what is this doing to the economy? We're creating parallel markets, and we're not, there's no end anticipated in sight. And that I've also been hearing is that because we've got the sale values in terms of auction market, and then you've got the paid, and what we're seeing people participate in both, and so there's this profiteering racket that is going on, and they are benefiting. Again, I can't understand even how it's been sustained in the lockdown periods, because there really hasn't been that much demand for business. So I'd like to see these business cases that people are putting forward when they're making this request for, and when we expect to see the gains, because it's an interesting kind of situation that is happening. I put that down to almost just a profiteering racket, to be honest.
So should we continue to have this sort of allowing the dollar, so dollarization, or should we stick to our guns and say, look, and go back to the Zimbabwe dollar? What's your view? I mean, that's a raging debate, but what's your take on it?
My immediate response to that is, let's get our economy assured. And the only way we can do that is to work in money that makes sense, and that is the dollarization. So I think at the moment, it would make sense to just stick to the dollar and do it properly, do it in a way that restores trust within the banking system as well. Because at the moment, so if we were on a de-dollarization program, then let it be that. Let's call it that. Let's give it a finite date. Let's say we're trying to get to this stage because as of this date, this is what we're doing. So this kind of it's all up in the air. We don't know. We've got a 3-tier foreign exchange market system, the parallel market, the formal auction market with kind of 2 strands to it, and it's not working. It's introducing profiteering rackets and kind of rent-seeking opportunities, and it's to the detriment of the economy at large.
Chinai Moyo-Mtambasere is a development economist. We need to take a short break now. When we come back, I mean, you've obviously given us where we are, what some of the challenges are. When we come back, we'd like to focus on what you would prescribe as the solutions and the way forward. Viewers, do stay tuned. The Rebound series continues shortly. Every Zimbabwean wants their country to return to its former glory, and we believe that we have a role to play in doing that. So we'll be speaking to different Zimbabweans from different facets of life to share their views of what it will take to get Zimbabwe to rebound. The Rebound series comes to you every Friday between 5 and 6 p.m. on the Heart and Soul digital platforms. Join me, Farai Mwakutuya, for those incisive discussions. We call this effort the Rebound series, and my guest at this point in time is Chinai Moyo-Mtambasere. She's a UK-based development economist. Before we went to the break, you were obviously pointing out some of the key challenges that this economy faces. Before we get into what you would prescribe, I just want to pick up on a few more topical issues and things I'd like to hear your views on. Inflation, obviously heading in the right direction, perhaps on course, and many people put it down to the fact that there's been this discipline, there's been no printing of money essentially. Do you see that holding?
So a couple of points for me in terms of using inflation as an indicator. At the moment, the inflation for Zimbabwe is a 3-digit base. So it's kind of like you're in the deep, and we're trying to say, whilst we're 6 feet under, we've just been able to dig ourselves up, by another 2 inches. So it's positive, but it's a long time. We're a long way away before we can even begin to look at the inflation figure as something really that is positive, because we're so far back. It's 300 odd percent, right? So, and even if we move that by another 10%, we'll still be at 290%. That's really bad. So I think we need to kind of stop looking at things like inflation for a while. Look at, social welfare. Look at, the impact on people that are pensions. Or what is happening? What is the income that the over 60? What is their income at the moment? How are they surviving? What is the cost of basic goods versus what we can afford as people at different levels? Let's look at education and attainment and outcomes and things like this. Let's look at social welfare. Really, that is what is important for Zimbabwe right now. It's no point working it out and getting 10 people to sit in the Reserve Bank, the central bank, and telling us that we've reduced inflation by 10%. I'm sorry, it's still bad. You know what I mean? So let's call it what it is. And in terms of it appearing stable, I would put that down to the fact that there really isn't much business activity happening. So there's really no demand to kind of shift it any other way. So I think what that is showing is just really a lack of business activity. And I think we might even be in a worse situation, because from what I'm hearing of consumers, they're saying local products are still too expensive. And as soon as people can go across to South Africa, demand is going to reduce again locally, and people are going to start buying whatever they were buying before, across the border. So I really wouldn't even begin to look at that to really show me anything meaningful in terms of the inflation figure and its stability. I think that's more down to just a lack of business activity. And it's so bad that any improvement on it at the moment will not mean much for the people and the general economy of Zimbabwe.
Well, as I said before we went to the break, we you've been very articulate in telling us what the challenges are. What would be your solutions in your view? If you were to come up with the way forward now, what would that be? You've obviously mentioned the issue that, social welfare should be priority. What else in terms of reforms and strategy in terms of economy?
Okay, so I would say, so like you said, social welfare, I would say some of our low-hanging fruits are coming from the whole relationship between the formal auction market and the parallel market. I think we need, if we want to have an auction, let's have an auction. Let's call it that. Let's make it available, easily accessible by different people. People walk in, they do their bids, and they go and do their business. Let's not price out, let's not put access barriers in terms of the informal sector, especially because, like I said, they're the ones holding up the economy. And as long as they cannot participate in the auction because they're not banked, then you might as well call it a day. It's not going to work. So I would say let's kind of move to a more single tier foreign exchange system, whether we do that formally through the banks or we do that through the bureaus, but let's just have a single tier. We have one rate that is determined by the market. I'd like to see the percentage of population increase in terms of the banked population. At the moment, we have more than 50% of the adult population unbanked. And there's good reason to that. Our banks make a lot of money from, for example, bank charges. They make, there's a lot of uncertainty from coming out of the monetary policy. And if we can try and fix those two things so that we can actually start to do banking the right way, we can actually start to rely on our banking systems properly, and sort of and not try to force kind of your risk ratios or your debt to risk ratios, trying to put these things in place that really don't apply because like more than 50% are not banked. So let's kind of relook at that relationship and improve our financial services sector.
Sorry, I just want to come in there and make the point that obviously, I mean, if we get more people banked, that creates and leaves, and creates these resources that banks can now lend out at hopefully much more attractive rates.
Absolutely. I mean, I was astounded to see that our policy rates are between 30 and 40% for retail banking. I mean, that is is extremely high. So these are sort of things that when we are putting things down, and I think in the region it's about, in South Africa it's like 3 point something percent. So when we are putting things in place, let's ask ourselves, how have we got to a place where our policy rate is 40%? Something is not right. And I think that comes from the currency that we're using, the pseudo RTGS, whatever Zim dollar currency versus the dollar. If we're going to use the dollar because really we need to, let's just do that, so that we start to look at things that are more realistic. You know, you will not have a dollar and a 45% policy rate. That will not happen because of the strength of but because you're trying to predict that in 3 months' time there's going to be more inflation, you've then got to account for that in your risk rates, and you just get these kind of very exorbitant policy rates, and not a lot of people can afford that. So there's a lot to be done from our monetary policy side, a lot to be done to really have a serious look at ourselves in terms of, you know, what should be our policy. Are we de-dollarizing? Okay, so let's align everything towards that. Let's have a finite date towards that. Are we hanging on to the dollar? That's what we're doing. Let's stick to that. And let's start to look at policies that are aligned with that. Whereas at the moment, we're trying to double dip. We're trying to keep to try and satisfy both, which you know, doesn't it really isn't working. And now is really not the time to kind of be doing those kinds of things, because we need a resilient economy. I'd like us to prepare more, especially for the informal sector. If there is a third wave, we cannot afford to go another hard lockdown. I mean, lockdowns work in countries like the UK, where they have a good social security budget. You know, they can afford for people to go into lockdown and kind of just issue out like interest-free loans everywhere. Whereas in Zimbabwe, we don't have that luxury. People must continue to work. They must continue to provide their services through the informal sector. How do we make that safer? How do we make traveling on the Zubco buses safer? You know, let's reduce the crowding. Let's allow people to plan more and maybe even self-organize. Let's maybe have a rota if you're selling somewhere. And you know, let's give them the opportunity to social distance and things like this. And this is what we should be focusing on, really. At the moment.
A couple of points from what you've just spoken about there. Let me just begin with the last one. You mentioned obviously the SME sector, the informal sector. The reality, as you say, is that that's where the majority of activity is now. There seems to be a push, or there has been talk for a long time of trying to formalize it. Can that ever be achieved? And should we really be sort of pinning our hopes on this informal sector? Should we ideally not be wanting them to formalize, to become bigger enterprises? Can economies rise on the back of SMEs or informal business?
Well, this is where, when we're looking at doing things the Zimbabwe way, right? So this is who we are. We have informal businesses. We have, and that has been the case and really on the rise because of our high unemployment. So you're finding that, as they call it, but what that is, it's actually informal trade. And we need to really, you know, you look at your ND, is it the NDS one? You look at your monetary statements, and you're sort of saying, okay, there's a huge chunk that's missing, and that's to do with the informal sector. And yet that is where everybody is. Even the people that are formal are in the informal sector. And that's a very important point, because when you're trying to start to address it, we need to understand all the different players, right? I want to make sure that for that informal trader, and that is their whole income, I want to make sure that they maximize their income. I want to make sure that they're in a position where they can get the most, you know, out of what they're putting in. And at the moment, and actually it plays to our advantage in many aspects, because what we're seeing is from the West is that formal businesses are actually struggling to survive the COVID pandemic. And why is that? Is because they're a lot less adaptable. When you look at the informal sector is very much adaptable. You know, we can change what we're selling. We can change kind of just like that. I mean, we saw when we had at the peak of the effects of the COVID pandemic in Zimbabwe, people were selling oxygen and all sorts. I mean, we might have different views on that, but the point is that it is an important part of who we are. And if you look at even our history, you at our pre-colonial history, we were formal traders. That is what we're upon. I think Africa, even as a whole, we need to embrace our informal trading. But what we perhaps need to do is to make sure that it's sustained, to make sure that there's no expropriation through it. And to be honest, there isn't in as many times as we get expropriation through formal and commercial businesses, we get a lot less of that through the informal sector, because if I buy and I sell, and pretty much everything that I do and can afford is in Zimbabwe, I'm sending my children to school in Zimbabwe, I'm buying school uniforms out of my trade, I am relying on local customers, and in some cases I'm selling local produce, whether it's my tomatoes or I'm sowing something, there's potential for me to employ. So it's not, we need to move away from this kind of not in my backyard perspective of the informal sector, and really embrace it and acknowledge that it really is what is sustaining the country.
Indeed. China, we must end it here only because we're out of time, but I think the point on which you ended on is great, because it opens us up to another discussion that we certainly need to be having on this program, where we look at the informal sector and how they can be, given their prominence and the role that they have to play in the economy. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for being a fantastic guest.
Thank you.
That does it for this edition of the Rebound series. I do thank you so much for tuning in, and we encourage you to follow us and like us, and watch this program whenever you can. Engage with us and interact on various platforms. It is available on Heart and Soul Broadcasting Services, the Rebound series. Be sure to join us again next time. Bye-bye.